I'm pleased to welcome Bruce McConnell. He is Cybersecurity Counselor, the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is responsible for developing the overall cybersecurity strategy for DHS and working with the National Security Council and National White House National Security staff on the overall national cyber strategy. Bruce has served on the Obama-Biden presidential transition team during the 2000. Before joining the administration, he created, built, and sold McConnell International and Government Futures. That was a boutique consultancy firm that provided strategic and tactical advice in technology, business, and government markets. He received an MPA from the University of Washington, a BS from Stanford University. His remarks today are on the record. He'll give you those remarks, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. So Bruce, welcome.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here and inaugurate this new space, which we'll see how everything works. And it's good to see many people that I know and see people I don't know also. So I want to spend about maybe 20 minutes or a half hour talking about the way we look at cybersecurity from the DHS perspective. But I'm also eager to hear and interact with you about what's on your mind in this area. It's a hot topic. I'm not here to talk about cyber war. I'm here to talk about cyber peace and cyber coexistence. So maybe that's a way to start. DHS has a well-recognized brand, but it's not clear that people understand what we really do. I mean, you see us in the airports. I know we're very popular there. With TSA, you see us after a hurricane with FEMA, and you see us on the border. And of course, increasingly, if you deal with the .gov, you see us, except of course you don't see us in cyberspace, and that's one of the challenges of cybersecurity is that it's kind of invisible. And so getting the understanding of what the stakes are out to the American people in general is part of our challenge collectively as people who worry about this, and by people who worry about this, I'm assuming you're on that team. So if you step back and ask about the mission of the Department of Homeland Security, it's pretty straightforward. Our mission is to create a safe, secure, and resilient place where the American ways of life can thrive. How do we do that? We have 5 principal mission areas: preventing terrorist attacks, protecting our borders, enforcing immigration laws, protecting, securing, and safeguarding cyberspace, and last but not least, making sure that we can respond in a resilient way as a nation when man-made or natural events occur. So those were the mission areas that we laid out in the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review a couple of years ago. And we're well known, I think, probably in all of them except in the safeguarding and securing cyberspace, so that's why I'm here today, to increase your awareness of what we're up to and how we think about it. Because I think we have, in commercial terms, if you will, a unique value proposition here that resonates with the way, the kind of cyberspace that I think most of us want to live in. So the Homeland Security approach and our approach in cyberspace is to approach it with the idea that we're going to try to create a system based on trust and confidence, not a system based on distrust and fear. And so it's true that we're all, and the country and all our companies and all the federal government agencies are under assault every day in cyberspace. But our goal is to turn that around and change that. Our vision is for a secure homeland, and that extends as well and is relevant as well in cyberspace. So what does it mean to be safe and secure in cyberspace? It means that we can be confident that our information is secure and our identities are secure. And security, of course, is easy to remember what cybersecurity is. It's about the confidentiality, about the integrity, about the availability of the information and our identities as appropriate, right? So we want the system, a cyberspace which is both open and secure, and that creates a tension. And so that's part of the balancing act that we all have to work together on as Americans. Our focus is not about threat. You hear every day about the threats, about how we're under attack from bad actors throughout the world, and that is certainly true. But our focus is more on the vulnerabilities. What can we do to ourselves to address the situation we're in? What is the problem, in other words, that we at Homeland Security are trying to solve? How do we define the problem? So we say the problem is that we are very vulnerable. We're very vulnerable in cyberspace for a variety of reasons, but the bottom line is we are. So what is to be done about that? In our view, it is to create something that, some kind of immunity in the community, if you will. It's a distributed responsibility and a distributed security that we're trying to achieve. And so I'll talk more about that in a minute. And who should do it? It takes a village, to borrow a famous phrase. It's something like all parts of Homeland Security. It's a shared responsibility. It's something that each of us, whether as individuals, as firms, as voting citizens, as service providers, have a stake in and need to be able to contribute to. So the question then is, in that overall context, how does DHS see us moving forward? And we are soon to be we will soon publish something called a blueprint for a secure cyber future, which details in some detail a strategy for moving forward and a vision for moving forward in cyberspace. And so while we're not releasing it here today, we should love it, but we'll have a little bit bigger event for that. I want to kind of preview some of the thoughts in that because it focuses attention, I think, and also gives you some feeling about how we are doing and serving the values that I mentioned. Values, American values, like ensuring privacy and civil liberties, preserving the innovative character of the internet in cyberspace, which is so important, making sure that private sector responses and technologies are available and that we use that and rely on that. This is not a government solution. So this strategy, this blueprint, if you will, is published by the Department of Homeland Security, but it is not about the Department of Homeland Security. We have a role, we have responsibilities, and I will talk about some of the things we are doing today that are consistent with the direction we're going on. But it, just like the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, which we published a couple of years ago, is a strategy for what we call the Homeland Security enterprise. You might say the Homeland Security community. It's about all of us and about each of us. So it is a roadmap that we have socialized to a great extent with various groups in the private sector and in the public. But it's really the first statement of it, and so it will be a work in progress. It's because everything in cyber is always a work in progress. And that's a good thing, but it does make it a challenging environment. So we want resilience, we want the continued innovation, we want public health and safety, we want to safeguard American values. We're going to use things like transparency. It's a shared responsibility. So within those general policy, overarching kind of value type statements, well, what are we actually going to do? Or what are we proposing, in fact, that the Homeland Security enterprise do, that we collectively do? So the proposal is to focus on two areas. The first is to protect what we call critical information infrastructure, and that's the immediate task. So if that infrastructure is vulnerable today, we need to protect it. So I'll talk about some of the thoughts we have about doing that. But it isn't enough to protect what we have today, because as any one of you who is practitioner in cybersecurity, and including all of us at our home, we're playing defense, and offense is winning. Offense is easy, it's low cost, it's fast, it's agile, low barriers to entry, high payoff, unlikely to be detected. Defense is very difficult. Have to close many different holes and constant updates needed, every patch Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera. So that is not a sustainable model. We want to get to a place, and so the second piece is what we call building a healthy cyber ecosystem. So we want to create a cyberspace that is secure, safe, secure, and resilient, so that it is in other words, inherently defensible and not in a place where offense wins all the time. So that's a longer term view. So we have those two pieces. So how do we suggest that the Homeland Security enterprise go forward and protect critical information infrastructure? And the term of critical information infrastructure, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, right? My information is very critical to me, but in general, I think we're talking about at the national level the kinds of information that make our country run, and the information systems, whether it be in electricity or finance or other key sectors that are now dependent on cyberspace to operate, to make sure that those places, the cyberspace pieces of those places, are protected. So the first thing is to prevent attacks. That's the first thing we're focusing on, and so a variety of things there. One example of what we're doing right now is sharing classified threat information and other threat information with key owners of critical information infrastructure to help them protect themselves. So right now we're not in a place in this country where we want the government out there defending private sector networks. So what we're doing instead is providing the information that we have and that we get from other parts of the government, whether it's from law enforcement or intelligence sources, and providing those to institutions so that they, for example, in the financial sector, so that they can protect themselves using their own protection systems. We are also deploying protection to the so-called .gov, the federal civilian agencies, and we've deployed the Einstein intrusion detection system to over 90% of the agencies now. That also contains information that allows us to identify the attacks that are coming in and prevent them. So there's a variety of other things in the prevent space. One of the questions in cyber is always the question of deterrence. What does deterrence look like in cyberspace? It was kind of easy back in the day when you could tell who was doing something, and we have a number of success stories where we have locked up some cyber criminals. It's small in comparison, admittedly, to the amount of cybercrime that is out there, but every time we raise the probability of you getting caught, there's a deterrent effect that operates there. So the second piece after preventing is responding. Prevention won't be, in today's environment, 100% successful, so we need to be able to respond and recover from the attacks that occur. And so that deals with the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. So the National Cyber Incident Response Plan is a public-private sector document that basically lays out what we do in the face of incidents. So incidents are happening every day. We're implementing the response plan every day at kind of what you would call a steady state level, because the steady state is constant incidents. But when there's major incidents, there are escalation procedures. And this all gets coordinated out of something called the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, which is at DHS, and that is a big floor with lots of screens and people at desks, so it looks like what you would expect it to look like. But the question is, who is at those desks? So yeah, there's DHS people from the part that worry about restoring communications. For example, after an earthquake or a hurricane, we have the responsibility of helping the government and the private sector restore priority communications to damaged areas. So those people are on the floor. We have a team that worries and thinks about industrial control systems, like the systems that control power plants, and they can fly away in the case of an incident and go to the customers, to the utility site, and help them patch and find what happened and find out what the damage was and prevent it in the future. And then there's the U.S. CERT people who are the ones who are watching what's coming in up to the federal agencies and also interacting with the security service providers, the vendors on that side. But they're not just government, they're not just DHS people on the floor first. The FBI is there, the NSA is there, a variety of other federal agencies are there as liaisons, and we coordinate with them and their watch centers when there are incidents and on a state-to-state basis. And the private sector is on the floor, and the state governments are on the floor. So the states are organized into something called multi-sector, multi-state ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center. And those folks are on the floor to coordinate response with the state governments. Similarly, the IT sector, representing the major IT vendors, is there, in the financial sector. The Treasury Department is there to help us with the financial sector, the Energy Department, etc. So it's a very broad group, public-private place where we can work together, again in a distributed fashion, to respond to incidents. So the third piece of the prevent side of the work, it has to do with maintaining a shared situational awareness. So in order to prevent and find out what's going on, and also to respond, you need to know what's going on. And so that's what that's about. The BN-KIC, the center I was talking about, is the place where that comes together and is broadcast out to other partners, either through alerts or through real-time sharing with the other federal agencies that I mentioned, and also as appropriate with the private sector. And a fourth piece of it is to make sure that we have resilience. So we have prevent, we have respond, we have awareness, situational awareness, and then we are trying to increase resilience. So that's, at this point, more about encouraging the private sector and the federal agencies to be sure that they have backup, that they are prepared to operate in a degraded environment in situations where there might be a major incident, because life must go on, the markets must come back up, the power must be restored. And so those kinds of things which we do through exercises. We're about to start a series of exercises now in November called Cyberstorm 4, which will be working both within the government and again with these private sector partners to test some scenarios which will involve a cyber-physical kind of incident. So that's on the resilience side. So that's great. I think my view is that there's we're making a lot of progress. We are coming from behind as a country, but we are catching up. When I first came to DHS, I would have said that we were barely staying even. I think we're making progress in that area. Not fast enough. We have to do more, and we need everyone else to do more as well. Turning then to the future, however, and what are we going to do about that? How are we going to strengthen the cyber ecosystem and really create that place which is a safe, secure, and resilient place for American ways of life to thrive in cyberspace? So the first piece of that, again, 4 areas, we're going to empower individuals. So what does that mean? It means building a workforce. So there's a shortage of cybersecurity professionals in the country, in the world. We need more of them, so we're working with the Centers of Academic Excellence and the National Science Foundation and the Department of Commerce under a broad initiative called the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is to develop curriculum, promote that, development of more cybersecurity professionals. And at the same time, we're working on getting those people to come to work for us. DHS is a really cool place to work. And so you should send smart cyber people to us. And we are building a place where we can retain them and reward them appropriately. But part of that empowering piece is also about improving just basic understanding of the American people. So you may have heard of our Stop, Think, Connect campaign, and it's very appropriate we're talking here today in late October because this is, as you all know, National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is drawing to a close. And so the Stop, Think, Connect campaign is a national campaign that was called for by the President in 2009. And in its first year and a half, it was focused primarily on teens and parents of teens and young adults, since most of us get our tech assistance from teens and young adults. So we thought, maybe they could focus more on cybersecurity that would help all of us. So that's why the catchphrase of that is stop and think before you connect. And so we've got getting some very good traction on that. We are partnering now with the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, the YMCA, YWCA, and the DARE campaign. And so that message is getting out. We've had dozens of meetings at colleges and universities to talk about this and spread the word about stopping and thinking before you connect. And what are the basic things you need to do? Keep your virus software up to date. Be careful about opening messages from people you don't know. All that kind of stuff. So that's the empower leg. The second area is to innovate, and in particular to promote innovation. So what are the barriers to innovation? One of the barriers in this area is that there is a lack of ability to connect tools. So there's a lot of tools out there. They don't necessarily connect very well, and a piece of that is in the standards area, promoting cyber protocols and standards in a way that allows technology to fit together better. A third area is about, and that can get into standards are not the most exciting thing to talk about, so I will go into that in more detail. But it's an important component of getting that ecosystem to work together. And that gets to the third piece, which is about collaboration. So you may have read a paper that we wrote earlier in the year called Enabling Distributed Security in Cyberspace. It's about the cyber ecosystem. The vision there is that wouldn't it be good if we had a more automated solution to some of these problems and could send security information from machine to machine at the same speed that attack information travels, which is, of course, at network speed. And so right now there's a lot of people in the middle of this, and if we could get to a situation where we could have machines helping each other protect themselves subject to human direction, then that might be a way of being more agile and having a more defensible environment. So what are the pillars of that? Because one of the things gets back to what I was talking about a minute ago about standards. Machines need to be able to talk to each other, so they have to speak the same language. So there's an interoperability piece to it. Another piece is that we need to automate the security information so that it's partly a standards issue, but we're working with the vendors and with the larger community to get so that we know here's what a warning looks like in HTML or an XML, and it becomes can feed automatically directly into a machine. Watch for this, block it or whatever the proper countermeasure is. So that's the automation piece, and then the third part is authentication. So you don't want to be getting your security instructions from a machine that's been captured by somebody who's trying to attack you. So we need to be able to authenticate. Earlier in the year, also, the administration released something called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. That focused primarily on creating a privately led environment that would allow people to authenticate who you are, who we are in cyberspace. It's an attack on the New Yorker cartoon from, I think now 17 years ago. Two dogs are sitting in front of a computer screen, and the one dog says to the other, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog. So that's still true today. And while it's amusing, it's a problem if the other person is your bank or something like that. And so at the same time, this is not an area where we want the government coming in and prescribing or managing individual identities. That's not something we do here. So this National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace is basically a roadmap for a privately led, cooperative, and distributed identity system in which people can register their identities with private sector identity service organizations who can then validate, yep, that is who he says he is, for whatever level at whatever level of security is needed for the particular transaction. So the good thing about that is that you don't have to give out all your information in every transaction. You just need to verify what are the 2 or 3 things that they need to know about you. Yes, that is that person, and yes, he does have that credit card, and that's it. You don't have to say, oh, and by the way, his date of birth is this, and social security number is this and stuff, even though that may be required for some other kinds of transactions. So anyway, in the collaboration space and in the this automated collaborative defense environment, you have to also have machine authentication, so machines can be authenticated with each other. So that's the other piece of that part. And then the last piece is to rely on transparency. So if this is a distributed problem, what do I need to know in order to do my part? So that's about getting the information about cybersecurity out there to everybody. Not just actionable information, although that's very important, but also a broader question about what is the impact of this? Because in some ways it's an invisible epidemic. If we talk about community immunity, well, this is a little bit of an invisible epidemic because there's no video. Right? So when in other areas of Homeland Security, there's video. So if some airplane flies into a building, there's a hurricane, people can see on TV what's going on, and that as humans, that gets us going. Here, when there's a cyber incident, you get two choices. You get some guy talking, or you get a picture of screens, guys sitting behind screens, right? Not very compelling. So we have all got an education challenge in terms of winning the hearts and minds, if you will, of people to take this thing seriously. And so that's a big part of being transparent about what's going on and describing the extent of cybercrime last year in the world is estimated by private sector analysts as close to $1 trillion. So it's a big deal. It's more than the drug trade. So cybercrime bigger than drugs is a message, but it's not as vivid just because it's financial losses. So that's the story there. I will say that one other thing, and then turn it over to you. As a part of this, and one of the areas that's challenging is that because this is a new and fast evolving space, our laws and policies, which are always a lagging indicator of social consensus, are behind. So they're behind in every area. The Privacy Act of 1974 speaks for itself, right? So the administration earlier this year in May, the president approved and we sent forward a legislative proposal that has a variety of different provisions that we think will improve the state of law in this area. It does things like increase the penalties for cybercrime. It consolidates the 47 different data breach reporting requirements that exist in various states into a national reporting requirement so that companies can more easily be in compliance with the law and let the consumers know when their data, personal identifying information has been breached. It makes explicit a policy that the president has put forth that DHS is the lead agency for helping and responding to events in the United States. We're talking about insider borders, not foreign attacks. And that we are the ones responsible for protecting the civilian agencies and also for working with the critical information infrastructure to protect it. And last but not least, it creates what we call a light touch regulatory regime where DHS would identify entities, companies, who are the owners and operators of critical information infrastructure, small number of companies, and require them to produce plans, which they should have in place already, to identify a list of, to identify and mitigate a list of risks. So the way this works is, and each of these steps is subject to public dialogue and discussion through the rulemaking process, but we would identify a set of risks that companies need to think about, maybe like, protect against insider threats. And then we would ask the private sector to describe some frameworks, some security frameworks that could be used to address the risks. So we would assume that various security companies and others, research institutes and others would come up with frameworks, and there's some already extant, like the ones that NIST has published, that would purport to address these risks. We receive those and we say these are some approved frameworks, and then the companies would be required to develop plans to implement those frameworks to address the risks as applicable to their pieces of critical information infrastructure. They don't send the plans to us. We could inspect them if we want to, if there's an incident, but in general it's subject only to a third-party auditing regime. So it's a light touch. It's really trying to get the private sector to take its own responsibility, but to create a level playing field there, because there tends to be a shortage of incentives to make the investment needed today, partly because of the visibility problem we were talking about. So we are hopeful that we can make some progress on that legislation in the current Congress. There are many other issues we could talk about, but rather than going on, I turn it back over to you, and be interested to hear what is on your mind, and happy to respond.
Thank you, Bruce. And the floor is open now for questions. I'll get a list going and identify some people. I'm going to take the liberty of the first question. What, from the DHS perspective and what you work on, what is the most vexing cybercrime and threat that you see, that you most worry about? You mentioned that primarily on defense. I mean, what is it about the offense in these areas that, again, keeps you working late or up at night?
So I'm aware of the offense because I'm defending against it, right? And on that point, I think what worries me the most is the vulnerability of our most critical information, and by that I mean two kinds of information. Primarily intellectual property, and so we've seen clearly in a variety of instances lately that intellectual property has not been adequately defended and has been stolen. So that's kind of worry number one. And I would say the other thing is, and there's a kind of a government version of that, which would be important sensitive government information. So the same kind of thing. And then I say the second area has to do with kind of identity theft and that piece, which is really kind of more of a chronic annoyance in some ways, but the pernicious aspect of it is that over time it undermines confidence in the financial system. Not that confidence in the financial system is where we want it to be right now, so we don't need that to add to that problem. So those are the kind of two long-term things that I would.
Thank you. Sir. And then there's a microphone coming your way, and if you could identify yourself and affiliation, please.
Hi, Ronald Marks at Homeland Security Institute at GW. I've got to ask you a bit of an ask here, Bruce, and it's not meant to be insulting, but it's meant to be a sort of a hard-on question. Look, we live in Washington, which is a bit of a rarefied government atmosphere here. I've run a few businesses in my life, and one of the questions I guess I would ask you right up front is, why in the world would the private sector want to cooperate on this? What incentives are there to do so? One of the aspects of the private sector has been the measure of risk versus cost. And the idea that they would spend X number of $1 million on certain security measures, and yet at the same time, if they didn't, then they might lose perhaps less than that if they did take that spending. If you talk a little bit about what kind of incentives you're talking about, or is this still at a general level of cooperation with the government rather than some kind of specific guidance or incentives?
Right, so great question, I appreciate it, and I didn't think it was a bad question at all. So I agree with your fundamental point, which is that, which I made earlier, I believe, which is that there are not the motivations for firms to protect themselves. They'll protect themselves up to the level of loss that they accept. They're not going to, and so there's a bunch of different reasons for that, right? At the moment, the market is not penalizing loss, so you don't see firms who have publicized there's a big fear among firms that they don't want to publicize their intrusions. So almost any company, right, has had intrusions. It's kind of a safe bet, and yet most companies aren't publicizing those. The SEC recently gave them the incentive to report those as material events, so that's an incentive. Although penalties from the government, last I checked, is not really an incentive. But the absence of So that's the kind of thing, but because the market is not, as you suggest, rewarding good behavior or penalizing bad behavior in this. And so, and because of the network effect of this, if your machines are owned by a botnet, you're a nuisance to all of us. And so there's a network aspect of this as well. So that's what so we recognize that, and the administration recognizes that in this space, the history suggests that market forces alone are not enough, and that we need to therefore create a situation where firms are at least given the incentive to make the basic investments, and that's what our cyber legislation does, would be to create a regulatory environment which would require at least the most important information in our country to be, where there's a national interest in it, to be protected. We also think that will, as those standards come out, which will be mandatory, if you will, for the critical information infrastructure, they will create a standard of care that will become a baseline for using the civil system to say, you guys didn't even do the stuff for my information that the Department of Homeland Security recommends for anybody to do. So that it creates a baseline there that might help the civil system attack those. So I think that deals with with maybe 80%, 90% of the vulnerability side for the most critical information over time. Again, over time until we get the new system built, which will be more defensible. So that's one piece. I think that there's a couple other parts. I think at some point, better safety and cybersecurity is going to become a competitive advantage. And we haven't gotten there yet, but at some point people will recognize that, hey, actually I would prefer to buy a safe service than one that's not so safe. And I think you're starting to see that, particularly as stuff moves to the cloud, firms are starting to go, wait a minute, I thought I knew it was protected here on my own machines, or at least that's what my CIO told me, but when it's out there in the cloud, how do I do due diligence against that? So I think that's going to have, at some point anyway, some ability for cloud service providers to say, and not only that, we have one of the more secure services. The last point is that there probably are some things in which it's not economically practical for each of us to defend ourselves against, right? So at that point, the question is, how do we, in the shorter term, create a more national approach to this? So the way we're doing that in the civilian agencies for the .gov is, as I mentioned, we're deploying intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, and kind of building a big firewall, if you will, in front of the Department of Agriculture, Social Security Administration, protecting those systems and informations which serve the American people every day. So we're doing that as a government, and we're positioning it in the cloud. So we're working with internet service providers of the government to have them take the traffic which is coming our way and put it through our filters, so that we can identify the attacks and stuff. So that's an appropriate role for us to do, and we've been given that role by the President to do that for the .gov. On the table at the moment for a conversation in our country is, well, where does the government, how far should the government go in that space protecting critical infrastructure? Because unlike physical protections, but like some things that we do in the border, but more so, right, we're talking about information. So, and the question about when the government looks at information in order to protect it is a subset of the larger policy question of when does the government look at private information at all. And we have a wide variety of laws which govern how that is done. But if you have to look at the information in order to see if there's malware in it, you raise a bunch of these policy questions. So this is not something that the administration has drawn a conclusion about. We did not propose a role for the government in our legislation to protect the .com. But I think as this policy debate evolves, we will have to address that question and figure out what are the proper safeguards to ensure that Americans' privacy and confidentiality are maintained.
Thank you.
Can't do that.
Taking notes on that last great point. Chris Meissner at Avicent. To borrow the military parlance, as some people do, one of the main struggles with the cyber domain is understanding its basic physics, how it operates in the air, we understand the air domain. So perhaps to translate this into DHS, we'll call it the cyber domain of peace, and understanding the physics behind that and how that affects your policies. And so one of the major questions I have is that you talk about a couple of the aspects of the physics of the domain that are challenging. One is identification, situation awareness, who did what and why did they do it. Another is speed. The speed at which this domain operates is simply unlike anything in the physical world. And so, perhaps as a clarifying point, I'll ask a very specific question. When you have an incident in a critical infrastructure, you guys are doing this every single day, Deutsche Bank gets a breach and they have to report. This stuff happens so quickly, and you say that, well, DHS has responsibility if it was a US actor doing this. Well, many times it's not a US actor, it's just a US entity being hit. In the case of Deutsche Bank, well, are they really a US entity? Well, depends on which part of Deutsche Bank got hit. Who ultimately has the immediate responsibility for dealing with this? Why? And then if it's not DHS or it's not a US entity, how does that transfer or pass off occur, and when does it occur?
Yeah. So, complicated question.
Sure.
Two aspects of it, right, that I wanted to drill in on. Kind of responsibility, for protecting oneself, and then kind of responsibility for responding, which is kind of where you're going with that, I think. So, there's a piece to that which I think was very important, which I didn't talk about, but so I appreciate your reminding me, to talk about the international dimension of it. So let's start with that. So none of this can be done by any single agency, none of it can be done by any single government, everybody including international. So next week there's a conversation occurring in London on norms of behavior in cyberspace. So we have norms of behavior in other domains. There's some behavior that is unacceptable, and when countries behave in that way, they are isolated in the international community. We don't have that in cyberspace, so there is an international conversation happening next week to pursue and discuss that problem and try to move the ball in that. That's obviously a slow process, but it's important. We have to get there. We have to get to a place where there's agreement on the planet about what's appropriate behavior and what is not. And there's lots of cultural values there that we've seen already in many types of situations. Particularly about the publication of information and freedom, what we would call freedom of speech, freedom of information, which is a value that not everybody shares in the same way that we do. So the point there was that in any of these cases, the Uber point is that it's a community, it's a village, it's a global village. It takes a global village. So on the point then of the a bank that is owned by a foreign entity, but has branches here in the United States, right? So the first responsibility to protect that is the bank itself, right? That's their job. They're supposed to do that to preserve shareholder values, their fiduciary responsibility. So, but we do get calls. So the government gets called by private sector entities that are U.S. based or have U.S. presence. And that call can come into any of a number of places. It may come into the Treasury Department. It may come into us at U.S. CERT. It may come into the FBI. There's been a crime that's been committed. It may come into NSA if there's a relationship there. So the incident response plan says, okay, whoever it comes into, that doesn't matter. Let's pool our resources, and we send up a team to take a look at what happened and try to because we're talking about an incident that occurred, and analyze the malware. This is what happened. This is what and there's private firms involved in this too, of course, because the bank is already at that point, got its own internal people plus private consultants in there looking at the same thing. So this collective public-private team says, okay, this is what happened, and here's what this is what the damage was. This is what you need to do, and then takes to the extent there's evidence there available for downstream prosecution, just like in any crime scene. So that's that kind of thing where it's a discrete attack on an entity, I think is something that we understand pretty well. When to the extent that there's foreign ownership issues and stuff like that, we have to obviously work with the other, with the hosting government of the host country. That's easier in the case that you mentioned. In some countries, it's more difficult. So we have, law enforcement agreements, again, hampered, as you suggest, by the speed at which those things operate, compared with the speed that the transactions operate on the net. But in the short term, that's what we're going to live with. That's the world we're going to live in. And so we just need to really hone and our processes so that they, work faster and better, which I think we're doing. I think it's been interesting to watch. We had several high visibility incidents over the past 18 months, and the response time, went from a long, from days, from a few weeks to days to hours. So, where it's a pretty fast learning curve on that, and it's encouraging.
Becca?
Hi, Becca Wasser with the IISS. I actually have a question from a Twitter user based out of London. You had mentioned this a little bit briefly, but what does the U.S. hope will come out of the London Cybersecurity Summit other than what you discussed, which was the creation of international norms?
So that is the purpose of the summit, to discuss international norms. So that's our goal there, is to, and I don't think we assume that we will leave the meeting with norms agreed to by everybody, but I think we are trying to push the dialogue forward, and we have great participation from all over the world, including the European Union, as well as all parts of the world. So I'm hopeful we can make progress on that question about norms and what's acceptable behavior. And I guess the next step we go is then there's the so what of what's an acceptable way of responding. But I think we're at the first part at this point. Thanks.
Thanks. Chair.
Hello, Claire York from Chatham House in London, and we've also been doing a lot of research on cybersecurity, so it's really interesting to hear your talk and to hear about all the different approaches that the US has. I believe the US is far more advanced than the UK on this at the moment, although I know they're trying to catch up through the conference that's taking place next week. I have a two-part question, if that's okay. You spoke a lot about engaging much more with the private sector, particularly on critical information infrastructure. And I was interested to know at what level you're engaging with, because a lot of research we've done has shown that CEOs in particular don't really understand the strategic, the financial and the reputational dimensions of this threat. And a lot of it is often left to the chief information officers and the chief technology officers. And there is that disconnect between the two, whereas actually this needs to be incorporated far more into strategy and risk assessment at a much higher level, even if they don't have the technical expertise. So I'd be very interested to hear the level that you are engaging with and the type of engagement and information awareness you're doing. And my second question links back again to norms. We hear a lot at the moment about threat and risk, and I know you were very keen to avoid anything dramatic about how this is all doom and gloom, which I think is to be encouraged. But I wonder whether you ever think this will be something that can be normalised, that it can become something that is a standard part of what we do, that we have to face on a daily basis, and not something that the media are going to jump on whenever there's a cyber attack and create something that's far more dramatic than perhaps would be beneficial or helpful to governments.
So, complex set of questions. Let me start with the second one, and then I'll ask you to repeat the first one. But I appreciate those questions. They're very good. So, on the question of normalization, I think we're a ways from that. I think this technology will mature, and we'll all, there's a guy, Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book about 8 years ago, a thing called Does IT Matter? And his thesis in there was no, IT is a utility. And his analogy was that at the turn of the 20th century, over 100 years ago, some of you weren't there then, but there was in many firms there was somebody known as the chief electricity officer, because electricity was this transformative thing that came in and really revolutionized the way you ran your manufacturing plant. We don't have those anymore. It's a utility. It's just built into the normal things. And when the power goes out, if it's widespread, there are stories. It's and Pepco gets beat up and stuff like that. So that's a state to be wished for, right? We want to get to that place where we don't need chief information security officers, or that they're not this big in the public eye. At this point, I think that's only to be wished for. I think we have some years to go. And I think part of that is, we're always playing defense. So we're just, we're vulnerable. So we're going to get, compromised, and that's going to be a story. And there's no way of, at the moment, we're going to become better at defending. That'll be good. But to get to the normalization place, we need to have an inherently secure environment where the electricity does stay on to cross into that a little bit. So back to your question about who we're dealing with in the critical infrastructure and whether it's at the right level. So what I've observed is that people generally, this isn't true, but if you were to make a broad generalization, firms and others pay attention to this. They give it lip service until they are attacked. And then they go, whoa, this is a big deal. And so my favorite example is the government of Estonia. So the government of Estonia, as you remember, a few years ago was attacked by unknown actors. Or hacktivists. Maybe it was hacktivists who did it. So anyway, and their government, which was one of the most advanced, electronic governments. They had their cabinet meetings on the web and everything like that. It was just down for weeks. So they on a worldwide tour now for several years. They've been out there, explaining, beating the drums. This is important. You got to pay attention to this. This is serious. So there's nothing like the zeal of the converted who have had the experience themselves. So that's one approach. That's not scalable, right? We don't want to get there where everyone is a big victim, and so now we all believe in it, right? So, but that is a factor, and so we are trying to work with senior people in groups. So we're working, for example, I had an interesting conversation exactly on this point with a bunch of business executives at a Wall Street Journal seminar. And these were chief financial officers primarily in the room. And so the question was, from not just from financial organizations, but from across the U.S. industry. And the question I asked was, how many, in your companies, how many of your chief information security officers report to the CIO, and how many of them report to the CFO or the chief risk officer? And it was about 90% CIO, 10% chief risk officer. My personal view is the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, needs to report to the chief risk officer because he's a risk guy, not the IT guy. Because the IT guy's job is to get the systems up, make sure they're running, not have to pay too much for them. Security is a cost center to him. And so to that point, he doesn't have the incentives within the firm. And besides, as we all know, the IT guys can't always speak in terms that the CEO can hear. We face this problem many times. And so by having them report to the chief risk officer, I think it would assign the responsibility in a different way. I mean, every company's organized differently, so it's not a prescription, but it's a different way of thinking about it. So I think you're right on with that point.
And did you want to repeat the first question?
That was I got it.
Yeah.
Oh, you got it.
Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
It came back to
that.
Thank you.
Dave?
David Chambers with MCD in Dulles, Virginia. I've had a question for quite a while. It's actually very specific, but I think it penetrates the cloud with something discrete and addressable. If essentially the cyberspace is really about mass communication with actors, I mean, as you said, the tool itself is not necessarily that important, it just enables, takes an actor. Still, if you can send an email to everyone in the world to get them to take an action, and that action allows some kind of cyber attack or penetration, has DHS addressed areas such as CPU architecture, where there are still some major loopholes because of some major, as I understand it, some major operating systems developers? How could those, I mean, if you're looking for low-hanging fruit to raise the, let's say, the quality of the cloud that the United States can touch, is DHS talking to entities, I would dare name one like Microsoft, about how they can close certain fundamental loopholes in cybersecurity, and how successful are you
Yeah.
in that?
Absolutely. So we definitely are. We have a group. I mentioned we're kind of working at the high level by sector. And so one of the first sectors that we're working with the CEOs, CEO level is in the IT communications companies. So we have a group called the Enduring Security Framework, which we're working in partnership with the Defense Department to talk to them about just the kinds of things you're talking about. Without going into details, I think we've made a lot of progress, in particular on some of the core architecture problems and vulnerabilities. If you watch what major industrial grade computer manufacturers are shipping now, there have been improvements in that core infrastructure that reduce the vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities, of course, have been around and known for a long time. It's the kind of thing that you can do, which basically improves the overall, reduces vulnerability, and that's what that's the key thing. So, absolutely.
Do you consider it successful?
I do. I think we're making some definite progress in that area. Definitely.
Next.
Thanks, Nick Hunter with the Cohen Group. Thanks very much for those excellent remarks, Bruce. I wanted to go back to the recognition by the Pentagon in end of May, when they said, cyber attacks could be met, with a military response. And I just wanted to ask you to sort of provide a little bit of context of what that means. What kind of a cyber attack would actually rise to that occasion where it warrants, that kind of recognition by the DoD, where it's going to cause real harm to our country, and then what kind of coordinated military response would need to happen in some sort of fashion, through close coordination between the agencies, between Intel, between the DoD, and others.
So, question about DoD. So I'm not going to answer for DoD. I would just say that if you look at the international strategy, the administration's international strategy, it does say that we will defend ourselves, and I think it's our view that in general it's more likely that some kind of what you're talking about, some sort of major cyber attack, is likely to come about when there is a period of already bad relations, and so it's likely to be part of an overall set of actions that might occur in those kinds of in very degraded set of international relationships situations. So I don't, at least the way I think about it is it's not going to be some isolated action. There are too many other factors involved and too many interdependencies, because we really all do depend on global financial systems and things to work together and trading with each other and that kind of thing. So I tend to certainly the potentiality is there for a major attack, but I think the likelihood is overplayed a little bit by some reporters and by some people who just look at the world differently.
And do you have a role? Does your DHS have a role, and perhaps you have an observation on what is being done, what more can be done to prevent leaks within the government? For example, what happened with that led to the
WikiLeaks, yeah.
Cable
Yeah, so the President released an executive order, I think about a month ago or so, that is the post-WikiLeaks executive order, which basically puts in place a couple things. Obviously, one of the problems there was personnel security, right? So you had somebody, a cleared individual, who was not the guy who should be having his hands on that information. So it's always hard to deal with that. But so there's a section of the executive order on personnel security, and then there's a section about information security, where there has to be a balancing act, because obviously, again, in hindsight, it's great. This individual shouldn't have had access to all that information. He had no need to know. But on the other hand, we learned from 9/11 that people were too protective, agencies were too protective of their information, they weren't sharing enough. So the pendulum swung to share. So, one of the downsides of that was, there was too much in one place. So that's been modulated. It was modulated a little bit in the executive order, but that's the second piece of, trying to catch that balance between need to know and responsibility to share. And then the third piece, of course, is the systems side of it. Basic things like don't let people use their thumb drives and take them in and out of classified and unclassified machines, which is what occurred in that situation. So I have a friend at the CIO who says that glue gun is one of the best cyber defense things, because you just glue shut the USB port, and then people can't stick their thumb drive in there and let viruses get on. So we don't advocate glue guns in the executive order. I'm just saying.
Well, Bruce, we at the IISS focus a lot on all aspects of conflict, its causes, its conduct, its resolution. And I'm listening to you today, I realize so many concepts that we all deal with, such as deterrence, such as the application or non-application of international norms and international law,
Yes.
concepts of sovereignty, escalation, what's an attack, what's a response, and what does an escalating time response means. All of these things are very much in play. It's a big task. That's some of the work we're doing at IISS. We'll address it in our book, upcoming book, and we'll address it in our work. And I know you're living this every day on the front lines. Very much appreciate your coming today and sharing with us your observations and your good work in this area. Thank you.
Thanks so much.